Okay, so last minute, get your water, coffee, whatever you need to stay awake.
Okay, we're live. Yasmin, you're muted. Symbolic of the censorship in Canada.
This is true. Thank you, everyone. And I'd really like to welcome you all to this incredible panel celebrating the launch of our special issue of the Islamophobia Studies Journal on digital Islamophobia and transnational feminism. I would like to begin by first of all acknowledging Professor Hatem Bazian, Professor Sarah Sharma, and Professor Anver Emon, who have graciously come together and collectively, I think, partnered in launching this and allowing this idea or this concept to come to fruition in so many different ways. From Professor Sharma's early intervention and support of the symposium that actually resulted in the publications that came into this journal, to Hatem's involvement in making this a reality, and also Professor Emon's involvement in sort of publicizing this and making it possible for Zeinab to be working on it at the same time. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to us, to all of you, our three major players here. So I'll begin with an introduction of Professor Hatem Bazian, because of his pivotal role, not only in terms of furthering and pushing the study of Islamophobia in its various guises and manifestations and across different platforms, but also his own sort of like incredible involvement in so many different things, from the grassroots level of lecturing in, doing guest lectures, to his involvement even on Twitter, to his incredible sort of and eloquent interpretations of different ayats of the Quran on Twitter and YouTube particularly. So Dr. Hatem Bazian is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. In the spring of 2009, Professor Bazian founded at Berkeley the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender, a research unit dedicated to the systemic study of othering, Islam, and Muslims. And in spring 2012, he launched the Islamophobia Studies Journal, which is published biannually through a collaborative effort between the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project of the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California at Berkeley, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative for the School of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco University, the Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, the International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia, and Zaytuna College. And I'm not going to go on because it's an incredible list, but it tells you the amount of work and commitment and dedication and effort that has gone into making the topic of Islamophobia a topic worth attending to, a topic that matters. And I think this is really critical. I want to then turn to Professor Dr. Sharma, who has a PhD from York Ryerson's Joint Program in Communication and Culture. And before she arrived at the University of Toronto, she was a tenured faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is currently the principal director, executive director, I don't quite know the title, of the McLuhan Center at the University of Toronto, not California. Her monograph, In the Meantime, Temporality and Cultural Politics, was named the National Communication Association's Critical Cultural Division Book of the Year. In the Meantime is an intervention in the popular sentiment that the world is speeding up. One of the things about, and Sarah has in fact graciously put in an introduction, a preface into this special issue on digital Islamophobia and transnational feminism that really brings to the fore the very idea of how platforms themselves are critically important to look at. And this is not simply a matter of just one message or one stereotype being recycled across, but how the medium itself affects the message. And it's really fitting because I'm reminded of McLuhan's adage, the medium is the message or is the massage. So Dr. Emon is professor of law and history and the Canada Research Chair in Islamic Legal History and a director of the Institute of Islamic Studies here at the University of Toronto. I shouldn't say here because I'm actually in Ottawa, not in Toronto. He's also the PI or the principal investigator of Reading Muslims with Dr. Yusuf Sufi. So you can see we have, in fact, a very eminent panel here of organizers or of collaborators who have made this possible. So what I would like to do now is to turn to, in fact, the first contributor, who is also the major co-editor of this special issue, Zeinab Farokhi, who has done a tremendous amount of work in bringing all of this together, but whose own work, I think, is such an important contribution to this area because of the way it brings theory and looks critically at what Sarah has talked about, the role of the platforms. So before actually I turn to Zeinab, I'm going to turn to Sarah to say a few words, and then and Zeinab, you can follow after. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's really actually super exciting for me to be in this room with all of you because this project in some ways started when Zeinab was in a class with me. And then I pushed her to gather other people around U of T that were thinking similarly to her. And then we had this symposium and this working group, and then this has happened. It's all over the last couple of years, and it's amazing. And also the other people that are involved. So I just want to say congratulations to Yasmin and Zeinab for this as well. Just a few things. I don't want to repeat what I already wrote in the preface to this, but one of the exciting things that this the special issue, but also the symposium did was that it pushed away from just thinking about mapping the ideologies present on the digital platform and started asking a different question, which was not so much the ideological climate of Islamophobia, but rather how does digital media and how does social media in particular actually reconfigure Islamophobia, which puts the media cultural theorist in the place of almost like having to do strategic and tactical work and thinking. And I found this pretty, I was pressing Zeinab in this way, of thinking about it in this way, let's not just map the representation, let's not just map how this, and let's not just talk about the tension between digital media being both a site for empowerment, but at the same time being a site of Islamophobia, but how does it actually reconfigure what constitutes Islamophobia, and then how do we respond to that? And so that's where I see the beauty of this contribution to thought, because it's quite novel in this way. So I was thinking, you have so much going on in this special issue, and one thing that really spoke to me was, and especially now too, the Palestinian digital poetry after 9/11. Which isn't just an example of how the internet is a tool for self-realization or provides a space, but it's also that the logics of the internet gave way to this sort of short form of poetry. And it reminded me of a lot of Audre Lorde's quote. I'm just going to read it here because it was when Audre Lorde says, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into an idea, and then into more tangible action." And I bring up this quote because this example of a media form emerges particularly within the sort of temporality and possibility of social media at the time. And it's also itself a tactic. It's not just a representative form. It's not just a site of self-expression. It itself is a tactic that uses the available media logics. So I'll end this by just saying that one of the things that you've contributed and left everybody to think about is to continue this work of thinking about Muslim life beyond the screens, but all the screen has to be part of a tactic all the time for the critical theorist and for the activist. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm looking forward to celebrating all of this with the rest of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to turn it over now to Zeinab because, and I was short, I did not do my job in terms of introducing Zeinab, so I'm going to take the time now to do it. Zeinab is a doctoral candidate at the Women and Gender Studies Institute and Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research interests include cyberfeminism, transnational feminisms, and diasporic studies. Her current doctoral work compares the usage of Twitter by Islamophobic right-wing extremists in India, Canada, and the US. And she focuses particularly on anti-Muslim rhetoric in Hindu nationalist and white nationalist discourse. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zeinab. Zeinab?
You hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Hatem Bazian, Dr. Sharma, and Dr. Emon for coming together to enable us to host this discussion on this special issue. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Yasmin Jiwani for co-editing the journal with me and helping organizing this panel. Thank you. So I just need to make sure that this is presenting properly. Give me a moment, sorry. For some reason, I'm not able to go back to my presentation here. Sorry, give me a moment as I am. Okay. So the name of paper that I published in this journal issue is Cyber Homo Soccer, a critical analysis of cyber Islamophobia in the wake of Muslim ban. So in this paper, through the parallel I drew between Giorgio Agamben's conception of Homo Soccer and Muslim bodies, I argue that in cyberspace where the exclusion of bodies can occur, Muslims render a Homo Soccer figure par excellence, which can be killed virtually. I refer to this figure as cyber Homo Soccer. So Homo Soccer is a person whose citizens' rights were nullified upon committing certain crimes and consequently reduced to a depoliticized naked or bare-life figure who can be excluded or exempt from society and therefore allowed to be killed by anyone with full impunity. In this way, this figure that is expelled from society is included in the form of exclusion and therefore stands between outside and inside the law simultaneously. Using Homo Soccer analogy, I contend that Muslims have been forcefully reduced to Homo Soccer, to bare life, and thus stripped of any social and political rights and dignity. Also, reflecting on the logic of refugee camp, where the suspension of law and the production of bare life are two of its key attributes, I propose that cyberspace can be read as a new modality of the camp, where modern politics are shaped by reducing some bodies, such as Muslim, to bare life. In this political realm of cyberspace, the normal rules are suspended and certain bodies like Muslim are reduced to the status of Homo Soccer, who can be violated while impunity is granted to the violators. So one of the similarities I observe between the refugee camp and cyberspace is the absence of sovereign law. In the refugee camp, sovereignty works through an act of abandoning subject, reducing them to bare life. Thus, sovereign law ceases to take an ethical responsibility when violence is enacted upon refugees, whether by the state or citizen. In this way, sovereign law abandons refugees since they are perceived as others who bring nothing but uncertainty, insecurity, and danger to society. Similarly, within cyberspace, this termination of sovereign law is evident. For instance, Donald Trump, who had nearly 44 million followers on Twitter, retweeted 3 videos from Islamophobia, hate propaganda far-right groups, of which at least one of them was proved to be fake. But he faced no legal consequences for posting such fake videos, despite the fact that there are certain laws related to dissemination of fake matter in the US that criminalizes such acts. But the sovereign law ceases from operating and creates and guarantees the situation that the law needs for its own validity. Hence, Muslim bodies who are subjected to various forms of violence in cyberspace are located in a threshold and are abandoned by the sovereign in an attempt to create naked life. They are potential enemies and outsiders who must be kept away to maintain the security of society, just like the refugee bodies when within the camp who are left as outsiders by sovereign. So despite the logical similarity between refugee camp and cyberspace, my reading of cyberspace as a camp is a bit different. Cyberspace as a camp is a more fluid than other forms of camp, given its ubiquity. Its fluidity facilitates the reduction of certain individuals to the level of homo sacer, who are exposed to indefinite violation for an unlimited period of time and space. That means that the transcending characteristics of cyberspace allow certain individuals to be marked as human, and some are as inherently inhuman indefinitely. Another distinction of cyberspace as a camp from other forms of camps is that extensive potentiality of cyberspace to reinforce the production of the birth life of certain individuals who are always already reduced to homo sacer. In cyberspace, not only are certain population reduced to birth life, but more importantly, this production is reified and reinforced in and through cyberspace, given its ubiquity, accessibility, which allows netizens to actively contribute to production of such bodies. Another significant attribute of this new form of camp is that the violence enacted upon certain bodies which are deemed as homo sacer is unlimited. In other words, symbolic injuries and virtual killing in cyberspace, unlike physical camps, are indefinite, which means that individuals who are deemed to be homo sacer in cyberspace can be banned, injured, or killed endlessly. In other words, within cyberspace as a new mode of camp, fear and terror revisit certain bodies, such as Muslims, making them susceptible to be injured and re-killed numerous times. That being said, I will now show some examples on how cyberspace is the new architecture of the camp produced by contemporary biopolitical states, wherein marginalized groups like Muslims are reduced to birth life and are subjected to various forms of violence while impunity is granted to the perpetrators. So I employed the discourse analysis of 2 hashtags, namely hashtag ban Muslim and hashtag Muslim ban, that went viral in the wake of the Muslim ban. So Muslim ban, and with the implementation of the Muslim ban that originally banned nationals from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, where the majority of the population is Muslim, from entering the US, Trump became the hero of anti-Muslim movements. Following the Muslim ban, Trump supporters deployed Twitter hashtags such as the one that I mentioned, ban Muslim and hashtag ban Muslim ban, to endorse the ban. So according to some users, the Muslim ban is necessary as Muslims are inherently dangerous and are actively seeking to Islamicize the public sphere and have no intention of integrating into a US society. Others indicate that Muslims are a threat to Western civilization and as such should be banned from entering the West. Some users even go further, demanding the removal and extermination of Muslims from the West, if not from the world. So here are several examples that I have put that showcase these themes that I just mentioned. So Muslims are incompatible with the Western society. When will you accept this fact? Another one says, it is not racist to ban Muslims. They don't want to assimilate. They want world domination. Islam and Muslims is a cancer trying to spread across the America and Europe. Stop it before the cult of this takes away your freedom. Hashtag ban Muslim. Time to deport all these evil people from our country and take America back. Another one said these animals want to come to the US, wake up America, ban Muslim, ban Islam. So Such comments demonstrate the degree of violence and horror directed at Muslim bodies in cyberspace. Given that users demand the annihilation of Muslims whose lives are seen as unworthy of being lived, the Muslim body become an example of cyber homosoccer par excellence. Policies like the Muslim ban legitimize the removal of rights of particular Muslim communities, reducing them to homosoccer. In the light of Muslim ban, the Trump administration created conditions where the bodies of Muslims were further forcibly stripped of dignity, social and political rights, and were abandoned to be injured, expelled, and killed within cyberspace. In fact, the Islamophobia rhetoric manifested in cyberspace reinforces the exclusion of Muslims from the nation, and Muslim became a single threatening entity, the unwanted dangerous citizen that need to be disposed of if the safety of nation is to be maintained. Therefore, Muslim bodies in cyberspace become a battlefield, a locus of state-sponsored violence, which is often overlooked by the law. In other words, in cyberspace, Muslims fall into a space of exception where they are within the system, but their rights are not fully recognized. This means that Muslims in cyberspace become constantly live in a zone where the law operates through its absence when it comes to the question of Islamophobic discourse. Therefore, cyberspace is a zone in which minorities like Muslims are abandoned and are reduced to homosoccer. The online discourse triggered by exclusionary politics like Muslim ban feed into the process of dehumanizing Muslims, thus deepening and reifying widely held stereotypes about Muslims as violent, subversive, animalistic, inhuman, and not worthy of living in a civilized society like the West. Such negative comments circulated on Twitter demonstrate the excessive politicization of Islam and Muslim body, which subject them to different types of biases and prejudice, resulting in vilification and ultimately the homosoccer and the politicization of the Muslim body. Given all this, the question remains then, how might individual Muslims and Muslim communities resist these profoundly violent figurations and positioning as bare lives, as cyber homosoccer? Further research should be done to track not only the perpetrators who tag such hashtags, but also to investigate the ways in which such violent rhetoric might be productively countered. And the work of Dr. Hirji and Dr. Oumlil are very illuminating in this regard. Additionally, considering the reduction to bare lives is likely not the only experience of Muslims. Further research should be conducted to document the potential avenue for powerful coalitional mode of resistance that bring groups together between Muslim and, for example, other racialized groups such as LGBTQ communities. The subjection of Muslims to the status of homosoccer is without a doubt is a profound concern, but such a virtual reality must drive us toward tactics which can shift the dispersal of netizens toward more responsible and responsive rearticulation of online politics and policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeinab, for that great presentation. And these are some of the themes that actually run throughout all of the issues, all of the publication, the articles that are featured in this special issue. So I'd like to turn now, Zeinab, if you would like to introduce Tanner.
Sure. Dr. Tanner Millers is an associate professor in the Communication and Digital Media Studies program at Ontario Tech University and a steering community member of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. His current research focuses on US empire and the cultural industries, war in the digital age, and far-right hate group and social media. Dr. Tanner?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Taha and I are delighted to be here today to share a bit of our essay with you, and we want to express our gratitude to everyone who made this event possible, and of course, especially to Yasmin and Zeinab for organizing the event and all of the hard work undertaken to bring this special issue to fruition. So Taha and I, have long been gamers, and we've played a lot of different video games across genres. And as a researcher, I'm also interested in studying the politics of these games as related to my bigger concerns around US empire and the cultural industries, past and present. And so our essay focuses on how digital war games produce and popularize Islamophobic stereotypes of Muslims in ways that interlink with the US empire's 21st century wars, that prop up patriarchal militarism, and also as related to Sarah's point about the medium specificity and the importance of considering mediums. This isn't just about representing stereotypes, it's allowing actually people to immerse themselves in playable scenarios in which these stereotypes are virtually killed. So I'm just going to share the screen. We have a little slide presentation, and can everybody see the slide okay? Okay, so I'm just going to open that up here. Okay, so a bit of our essay then. So, as everyone here certainly knows, the othering of Muslims by Western empires, old and new, has been happening for a very long time. And this is demonstrated by Edward Said and numerous scholars and many researchers in the post-9/11 context as well. And from the 1970s forward, and especially in the post-9/11 context of the so-called global war on terror, researchers have shown how integral Islamophobia has been to the US national security state's attempt to organize public consent to very controversial wars, occupations, and conflicts in Muslim majority countries. Relatedly, researchers have shown how, in this context, the United States news and entertainment industries have ratcheted up the production and circulation of stereotypes of Muslims as enemies and threats. And these researchers have probed how the US's broader imperial culture has worked to make violence and hate against Muslim people in the United States and elsewhere seem uncontroversial or even necessary to the protection and promotion of American and, by extension, Western national security. So Taha and I build upon this research in our recently published article, The Virtual Killing of Muslims, Digital War Games, Islamophobia, and the War on Terror. So here's the gist of the argument. So when we think about video games, we often think about entertainment. We think about entertainment produced, distributed, exhibited by sort of a US-centered transnationalizing industry, a for-profit industry that really is about producing entertainment commodities for sale on the market with the hope of realizing some form of exchange value. But entertainment, even though it's part of a multi-billion-dollar global industry, these video games are also very, very political. And this is often what is not addressed in some popular coverage anyhow. It's not just apolitical, it's not just escapist, it's not just entertainment. Many of these video games, as we show, intertwine with and often support real and ongoing wars. And so, here you have a screen sort of image of the CNN's coverage of the war in Iraq, explosions in Baghdad, of course, obscuring the human casualties and consequences and the people harmed and killed through this shock and awe campaign. And in tandem with this, we have the industry releasing Desert Storm 2, Back to Baghdad, inviting players to virtually play along the real invasion. So for the past 2 decades, the US and some of its NATO allies have been involved in military conflicts, either directly or indirectly, with Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Pakistan, Iran, Somalia, Libya, Syria. And in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan alone, over 500,000 people were killed by these US-led wars. So throughout all of these 21st century wars, the US military has made a number of strategic uses of video games. So again, concretely utilizing real war games for real ends related to real war. So for one, the US military funded, designed, and launched its own video game called America's Army to recruit teenagers to the ranks. And nowadays it also uses popular war games such as Call of Duty, esports tournaments, and even the Twitch streaming platform to recruit new teenagers as prospective personnel. Secondly, the US military uses war games to promote a very positive image of itself to the public, perhaps to maintain morale within the ranks, especially given how controversial and contested these wars are. to also support sort of the troops with this kind of support the troops mentality that's pervasive in US society, and also to maintain support for budgetary expansion. Of course, wars have cost trillions of dollars, and to do sort of this, you need to actually have a public that's in some way compliant with or lacking sufficient dissent for these ongoing increasing military expenditures. Another thing that the military has done with video games is basically train new and existing personnel to fight real wars, immersing personnel in simulation models of battle strategies and tactics, and also introducing them how to use new weapons technology in preparation for real wars that are more and more reported to be perceived by soldiers fighting them as just a simulation or a game. So there's this real blurring or de-differentiation between the real and virtual wars in this context. And moreover, the military also uses war video games to treat the soldiers afflicted by post-traumatic stress disorder, basically trying to virtually rehabilitate them by playing through the traumatic violence that they enact and that they endure. So those are 4 of the strategic uses of war video games by the real US military over the past 2 decades. So video game companies are not owned or controlled by the government or by the military, but they've nonetheless, kept pace with these real wars and made billions of dollars, producing and selling war games. Most of these immerse civilian players in the roles of male Anglo-American soldier heroes who virtually invade enemy countries and kill a wide variety of villains who supposedly threaten the American way of life. So a decade ago, Vit Sizzler demonstrated how first-person shooter games represent Arabs and Muslims as enemies, flatten out the diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious identities of the Islamic world, and present a monolithic representation that incorporates neo-Orientalist and neo-imperial imaginaries. Some recent journalism concurs with this assessment, noting that many digital games exploit stereotypical cliches about Islam and represent Muslims as the other people, the enemies of the US and the West. And there's another strand of research in extremism studies and in security studies that focuses on the creation and use of digital war games by Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS for recruitment and also propaganda purposes. But we noticed a dearth of substantive literature on this topic that engages with specific war games and the ways that they specifically frame and represent Muslims as enemies. So the goal of our research was to probe how digital war games may perpetuate Islamophobia as related to real 21st century wars of empire. And we wanted to foreground the importance of a critical study of these games to some salient and intersecting areas of transnational feminist theory, research, and politics. So over to you, Taha.
Thank you, Tanner. So to find out if these digital war games conveyed stereotypes of Muslims as the enemies of America and espoused Islamophobia, we analyzed 10 popular war games: Conflict Desert Storm, Conflict Desert Storm 2, SOCOM US Navy SEALs, Full Spectrum Warrior, Close Combat First to Fight, Battlefield, Army of Two, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, Medal of Honor, and Medal of Honor Warfighter. So you might be asking, why these games? Well, we chose these games because they were published between 2001 and 2012, which was a period characterized by the Bush administration and Obama administration's global war on terror. In addition, these games contained interactive stories in which the US military battles people implied to be Muslims, so they're directly relevant to our study. Furthermore, these games were among the best-selling and the best reviewed games in the war game genre for this period. So we focused on games that got at least a 7 out of 10 review or sold at least 1 million copies to make sure that we're really covering the most popular games. So as part of our research process, we played these games from start to finish and examined their trailers, marketing materials, and walkthrough guides, all the while making detailed notes about how they represent Muslims. And overall, we found that these games conveyed largely simplistic stereotypes of Muslims as Arabs, foreign, violent, terroristic, and anti-American. We found that these game stereotypes combined to form what we call a mythical virtual Muslim that may shape ideas and perceptions of real Muslims. In effect, these games add to the popular cultural repertoire of Islamophobia. Although players can distinguish between the US's real wars and playable war games, These games risk desensitizing people to war's embodied horrors and deterring the public from democratic deliberation about war's causes and consequences. For decades, US wars in Muslim-majority countries and American Islamophobia have marched in lockstep, and so this digital vilification of Muslims is not surprising. Yet, the game stereotypes of Muslims should not be treated lightly because Islamophobia is a real and growing social problem. As irrational anti-Muslim fear and hatred has increased in the US, Canada, and elsewhere, the US empire's Islamophobic digital war games industry adds insult to injury and intersects with the current patterns of anti-Muslim prejudice, discrimination, and violence in society. Such stereotypes place unnecessary public attention on and may instigate anxiety about real Muslims living in the US and elsewhere. This, in turn, may sanction the intensification of state surveillance and policing of Muslims, not to mention public support for the ongoing disproportionate allocation of public resources and national security projects to combating the perceived Muslim terrorist threat, instead of white supremacist organizations and other growing and greater terroristic threats.
Furthermore, these games' major Islam-related representations are so negative that there's a risk that players who have had no contact with real Muslim people may think that this digital portrayal is true. So again, we want to emphasize that we're not claiming that digital games unilaterally cause people to dislike or harm or commit hate crimes against Muslim peoples, but we are arguing that they may reinforce existing prejudicial outlooks, especially among those on the white supremacist far right, who are responsible for so much anti-Muslim hate speech and hate crime across all of the major platforms online today. Moreover, the far right and the white nationalist and proto-fascist and neo-fascist right is also creating its own explicitly Islamophobic hate games, such as one that allows people to replay the Christchurch terrorist attack by Brenton Tarrant, a white supremacist. And here you have a screenshot of that awful terrorist attack being simulated in a video game. So, well, it would be an exaggeration to claim that all published and played digital games convey an Islamophobic representation of this diversity. The immensely profitable and globally played games that we studied mostly do. So how can we go about challenging these Islamophobic video games?
So we hope that our study will make both current and future digital war game developers and players aware of this issue. Developers should make a concerted effort to create more multidimensional representations of Muslims, and players need to understand that the motley group of Muslim enemy characters do not reflect the majority of real Muslims who live, work, and play in the US and around the world. If the portrayal of Muslims in digital games is to change, then those with the power to design, produce, publish, and sell these games must be made to care and change their designs. Over the past 2 decades, Muslim Americans have pressured the US film and TV industries to stop stereotyping Muslims. However, only now is the interactive entertainment industry, as in video games, beginning to face similar pressure. Much more work needs to be done to keep the pressure up and push for reforms. And there are some signs of representational change, such as the Assassin's Creed character Layla Hassan, an Egyptian, American, and proud New Yorker who is a strong-willed, highly educated computer engineer, who is central to the game's story and missions, so she's not just a one-off side character. Importantly, the US digital games industry must do more to include and represent Muslim game developers in its workforce so that they can represent themselves, tell their own stories about Muslims living in the US and elsewhere, and counter Islamophobic stereotypes. Tanner and I hope that our study contributes to the steps being taken in that positive direction.
At the same time, we want to be sort of attentive to the limits of representational change, given that the US and its allies have been engaged in basically 2 decades of war in many, many countries. Given how the US empire's 21st century wars and the new Islamophobia have marched lockstep, it's quite possible that there'll be no end to the war against Muslims unless there is also an end to the wars the US is waging. And there may be no end to Islamophobic war games, given the receptivity to them in the US and international market, unless there is an end to the real wars in the Muslim countries they simulate. In that regard, a major change to the representation of Muslims in digital war games might have greater chance for efficacy with the revitalization of the global peace movement, an anti-imperialist politic, and a new renewed politic of international human solidarity. Thanks again for letting us present our work here today. We're really honored to be here, and Taha and I really appreciate the work that everyone's undertaken in this special issue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tanner and Taha, for this very insightful paper. It was very interesting. And now I'm going to introduce our next presenters, Dr. Yasmin Jiwani. She is a full professor and university research chair in intersectionality, violence, and resistance at Concordia University. She is also the author of Discourse of Denial, a critical examination of racism, sexism, and its circulation through popular media. Over to you, Dr. Jiwani.
Thank you so much, Zeinab. So I don't have a PowerPoint because I prefer to rely on the medium of speech. And usually what happens is with a PowerPoint, it goes one way and my speech goes the other way. So I'm going to start out with a quote that I really liked that's in Sarah Sharma's introduction, preface to our issue. She says, the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment that gathers online feels like a form of digital toxic sludge, a garbage patch in a vast ocean that takes on its own life and seems harder and harder to track and even more difficult to eradicate. And this is exactly how I felt when I started looking at these online comments, because unlike Twitter, unlike the games that we've talked about, when you look at online user-generated comments, these are usually in the form of comments that are posted to news sites in response to various news articles. So I was drawn to this particular issue because at that time, if everybody recalls, the famous case of Shamima Begum had hit the headlines in the UK. And the idea was, what happens to these women that have gone and made the perilous journey to the other side of the world, so to speak, metaphorically, to join ISIS fighters and to join the ISIS movement? And what happens to them in terms of how is their agency actually perceived? And how then is it treated within the mantle of a particular kind of Islamophobia, a gendered Islamophobia? So in looking at these cases, I was drawn to particularly two instances, two women who were trying to come back to Canada. They were wives of ISIS fighters who had gone over to join their husbands. And I don't know what that was, but and anyway, were stuck there in the various camps and had to be brought back. So in looking at this literature, one of the things that struck me right away was the fact that these women were often referred to as jihadi brides. In other words, they didn't have an entity, an identity by themselves. They were always, their identities were affixed to the fact that they were brides. So they were like these brides of monsters or monstrous brides that somehow wanted to come back but couldn't come back. The other striking thing was the fact that they were, in contrast to the fact that Muslim women are often portrayed as abject, passive, submissive, docile, and oppressed women, these women were not shown to be like that. They were, in fact, shown to be quite contrary. So their agency was twisted or was somehow converted into an understanding of agency as being detrimental rather than agency as being valorized, as in the cases of the mainstream feminist movement. So how agency got converted and transformed from something valued to a sign of something that is horrendous or horrific was very much contingent on the fact that agency here was yoked to something that was collective, that wasn't necessarily individualistic. So when we think about Western ways of seeing and Western ways of sort of valuing norms, the idea of that individualism becomes paramount. And when something is considered to be collectively yoked, it no longer has the same value. So in looking at these two women and the interviews that they did, what I looked at was, in fact, about 850 comments that were posted online to Global's interviews, or not just of these women, but its series. It was a 3-part series on the returning ISIS fighters and their, quote, wives. And what was striking was the fact that in the first installment of the series, the focus was on a man who was returning back and who was being interviewed by a very well-known terrorist expert. And in that process of talking about his return, he's made to seem like as inauthentic as possible, that he was in fact lying, and that it wasn't clear whether in fact he was using the card of a refugee or sort of like just basically that he was tired after committing all kinds of horrific crimes and just wanted to come back. So that was the first installment. And then the subsequent 2 installments focused on the cases of 2 individual women. One who was Somali and from a well-known part of Toronto that is home to the Somali community, but is also race-coded as such. So we're talking about the Dixon area. And another one who was from the prairies. So in both cases, the women were portrayed as, as being ungrateful for having left the haven of the Canadian multicultural heaven, so to speak, and going on this other side of the dark, horrifying, cruel, and barbaric side of Islam as portrayed by ISIL. So in looking at these comments, what I was really looking at is how, in fact, there was a kind of network sociality that was emerging as these people interacted with each other. So the medium became really interesting because this wasn't just one-off comments. These comments were actually building on each other. There was a kind of to and fro, a call back response that was going back and forth. And through that process, there was in fact an accretion of messages that were sort of layered one on top of another, that were giving this kind of toxicity an even greater potency, if you will. It was becoming quite powerful. And what was so interesting was that how agency here got translated into something that the women were blamed for. That in fact, their going over there was something that they were responsible for, that they had to pay for, and therefore they should just rot and die in hell. So that was one major theme that came across. And the second one was in fact how by coming across, for us as Canadians to bring them back, we were in fact allowing a potentially dangerous contagion to creep in. And that these were sort of like breeders of these horrific, very much like the sci-fi notion of the alien that breeds so many different sort of like offspring that is going to engulf and take over. And this was a theme that was there. And also finally was the theme that in fact, these women were inauthentic, opportunistic immigrants, that really they were just coming back because they couldn't get the kind of support, live off taxpayers as they could have if they remained within the camps, which were horrifying. And many of these women were actually not only extremely ill, but had children that had died. So these were the kinds of messages that were coming across. Now, what's so interesting and how this kind of ties into both Tanner and Zeinab's papers is the fact that as in video games where you can continually kill and re-kill and kill over and over again, so this sort of accretion, this layering of the discourse was doing precisely that. It was allowing that hate to vent over and over and over again. And through that kind of cumulative power, acquire a kind of tenacity that it otherwise wouldn't have, that it might have evaporated. So that was one part of it. The second part of it was that Global's post-moderated. So in other words, they're cleared off the site after. But I would find these on Facebook or through their plugin and through other sites. So it's very clear that, as Zeinab was saying, even though Global has, in fact, a policy that would sort of allow for the moderating of and removal of all kinds of violences that are posted, that in fact this wasn't happening. So in other words, sovereign power was no power there. And in fact, you had these netizens that were exercising sovereign power by continually making these women's lives bare in every which way possible. So they could be killed with impunity and they could be left to fend for themselves, but they were never considered Canadian. They were never considered part of us and them. And that goes back to the ideological square that Van Dyke talks about, which is sort of implicit throughout all of these papers, in fact, in terms of there is an us and there is a them, and we should not allow them back in. So many of the comments, in fact, and I'm not going to go over the comments, but were very much like the comments, the tweet that Zeinab showed in her paper. And one of the things was, in fact, the kinds of comments that were posted. Some researchers have argued that online commentary is basically there as a way, becomes toxic because there is anonymity afforded to the users that are posting it. But it's not just the anonymity, it's the fact that you can say this and have somebody come back and affirm it and then say it again and say it again. That's part of the thing that's going on. And the other part is, of course, the context collapse, because we don't know the backgrounds of the people that are posting this. Finally, and I'm going to end here, one of the things that was so clear was how, in fact, the discourse around the women itself became a vehicle through which to attack the state and to attack global media. So how, in fact, these signifiers are being used in the language of hate is precisely as weapons that can be directed at particular sites of power. So in a way, what we're seeing is, in fact, a rising up of a kind of populist power against the state. But at the same time, how this populist power is then using the conduits of Islamophobia, gendered racism to actually create a kind of an open attack on the state. So I'm going to conclude here and say that, one of the things that sort of identifies Islamophobia and the register that I used was, in fact, the Runnymede Trust criteria of what defines Islamophobia. And you can see all of these playing themselves out here in the kinds of posts that were posted. So Islam as monolithic, as separate and different from other faiths, as inferior, aggressive, Muslims as manipulative, which has been found over and over again, an anti-Muslim discourse as natural, and that any criticisms that Muslims have of the West is rejected or dismissed. And you can see that even now. And of course, that any kind of discrimination against Muslims is justified. So all of this to say that this kind of sort of toxic sludge not only congeals, but is now being directed as a weapon. And in the process, influencing policies and practices. And this is where the kind of Islamophobia becomes both structural and personal. So I'm going to end there, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for this great and important work. Very inspiring. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to next speaker, Dr. Faiza Hedgery, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia. She specializes in research exploring media representation of race, religion, ethnicity, and gender, use of media in the construction of identity, popular culture, and youth, and the importance of media within diasporic and transnational communities. Over to you, Dr. Hedgery.
Thanks so much, Zeinab. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I think this notion of a covenant with nature and of treating the land and all of its occupants with respect is certainly one that weighs heavily on many of us at this particular point right now. So I don't think this issue and panel could be more timely. I feel privileged to be included. So thank you so much to the organizers of this panel today, the organizers of the special issue, and also the organizers of the conference that started it all, at least for me, back in early 2019. So in 2018, I received an invitation from Zeinab and from Victoria Tamasaibi Bargani to participate in a one-day symposium hosted by the McLuhan Center on the topic of transnational feminism in the age of digital Islamophobia. And that topic is one that I'm always thinking about, and I keep coming back to, even though I sometimes say that my work has migrated in other directions, and sometimes I think perhaps the preoccupation with Muslim women's bodies will end, but it never really seems to. And so my early and ongoing work has been around the subject of Muslim women's bodies, the fetishization of the body, the covering of that body. And a lot of my work has been on media representation. And I'm always moving back and forth in terms of my beliefs on whether or not this representation has improved and what kind of real world impact this has had for Muslim women in terms of understanding. Because I think in some ways, listening to Tanner and Taha talk about video games, I think one of the things we've often been told in communication studies, but I think that I've particularly felt very acutely this year, is the way in which the world of media and real life seems to have collapsed so entirely in the ways that Baudrillard foretold, perhaps. So in terms of media representation, there has been some broadening beyond what I call this figure of the Muslim femme fatale, this figure who is always some kind of threat, though the nature of the threat may change over time. So sometimes it is the figure who is disguised as a terrorist, but sometimes it can be something that is more subtle but equally insidious. The woman who refuses to integrate, for instance, and what does that mean in societal terms more broadly? So the nature of the threat may change over time, but there is often this notion that the Muslim woman represents some kind of threat. And although scope of media representation certainly has broadened, I think we still see ourselves coming back to this notion over and over again. And this notion, I think, underpins the reactions that we see when Muslim women emerge who could be seen as perhaps real life role models. And in case anyone's interested, these figures are from Jack Ryan, Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan, Little Mosque on the Prairie. And this is from a very recent Eid episode from Your Royal Detective. But so when Muslim women do emerge in so-called real life, quite prominently as activists or as public figures in different ways, we do see a very strong reaction in many ways, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, sometimes more ambivalent. And when they emerge, they are carrying on a tradition of feminism that has often been portrayed as off limits to Muslim women. So we're often given this impression that Muslim women are oppressed, they don't engage in feminist beliefs, that they don't participate in activism. But in fact, this disregards the real history of Muslim women's political, social, and intellectual engagement. So it's certainly not a new phenomenon, and Fanon and Mernisi and others have talked about this. But often this is sublimated in a lot of the media texts that we see. And the nature of this activism can evolve to meet the need. So social media may make Muslim feminism more evident for those who don't know that it's always been there. Muslim women speaking out is certainly not a new phenomenon. And since social media is where some people seem to do so much of their living, their thinking, and their engaging these days, I wanted to look more closely at a few Muslim women whose online activity has been particularly interesting or notable to me in different ways. And normally I would try to narrow down to one or two case studies that could be compared, but it seemed to me during the time I was working on this paper as though all of these figures spoke to different and equally important aspects of what it means to be a Muslim feminist. And so I ended up writing my paper on what might seem a rather diverse group. It is a rather diverse group, but I thought that they all represented something important in terms of how the media interact and digital media in particular interact with Muslim women in their activism. And so I narrowed it down to Aisha Malik, who is somebody I sort of relatively recently became aware of when I was researching a Bollywood paper, actually. So Aisha Malik is actually known as a beauty influencer, but suddenly came to greater prominence online after she publicly challenged Priyanka Chopra at an event where shortly after Chopra had tweeted out a message of support for the Indian Army. And this was just when the conflict in Kashmir was ramping up. And so Malik was particularly sort of struck by this and wanted Priyanka Chopra to talk about why she would send out what she saw as an inflammatory tweet when she is supposed to be a sort of global ambassador for girls and for human rights. And she was quite taken aback and offended by the way she was silenced at that particular event, and went on to talk more about this particular issue. Other figures that I think many of you will recognize, I don't have a picture of Rashida Tlaib here, but Ilan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who I've kind of looked at in some ways as being part of this, being encompassed by similar phenomena as political figures who have been very, very vocal, very progressive, very committed to human rights, and subsequently have faced considerable backlash. I think particularly Omar, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Rahaf Mohammed, who I think has certainly enjoyed enjoyed is not the right word, but certainly rose to international prominence when she fled Saudi Arabia, organizing her escape over social media. And interestingly enough, in an era where there are many complaints about Western countries not being able to take refugees or immigrants, many countries opened their arms to this particular figure. And I think because of the kind of Muslim feminism that she represented.
Okay, please switch.
Sorry, one moment. Sorry. Of course, they were fine the whole time. And of course, it's when I'm speaking. Sorry. So I think I was just at the point of I was finishing talking about Rahaf Mohammed, and then saying that the other case study I decided to look at was not specific to one particular Muslim woman, although I do have an image here of Moana Alkahawi, who some of you may recognize. She's very vocal on social media. She's published a number of books, coming from an Egyptian background, but also I think residing in the United States, and associated very prominently with the hashtag #MosqueMeToo. And I have to say that this is actually a debt that I owe to my former graduate student, Naima Bawa, who did her master's work on this and really closely analyzed some of the tweets associated with that. And also to my colleague, Dilyana Mincheva, who I think introduced this topic to Naima in the first place. So I looked at these different case studies because I thought that they all brought out something that was very different in terms of how feminism is portrayed in this particular context, how they function within this Islamophobic space. Does the digital space make it more possible to interact in ways that are progressive? Do we remove some of the constraints that we might find in other forms of activism? And other forms of politics. And so I wanted to look at how that functions, because they're all coming from very different perspectives. I think Aisha Malik, who doesn't necessarily set herself up as a political figure, but almost accidentally comes upon it because of the very visceral sort of nature of the reaction that she has to Priyanka Chopra. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar taking a more sort of conventional political route, and then of course others taking what I would see as perhaps a slightly less conventional route. So I used the notion of critical discourse analysis, and I applied a post-colonial feminist lens to selected tweets from each of these figures to try and get a sense of whether or not we actually have something progressive happening here. So is it possible, as I think many theorists have suggested, that digital space is empowering space? So this concern that I identified earlier with the Muslim woman's body and the fetishization of it, the constant concern over veiling, for instance, does that go away in a digital space where, certainly my students are always speaking very positively about the way you can interact online, and who you are doesn't matter, and it's all about the quality of your discourse. This is a very Habermasian kind of concept, of course, but of course we know what are some of the greatest critiques of Habermas. They come from feminists, and they come from people of marginalized groups. So is it true that one can function online simply competing in terms of their political arguments and the quality of their discourse, the quality of their arguments? Perhaps not surprisingly to all of us here, I didn't find that to be the case. But I would also like to say that I do think that it can still be a hopeful space, but it's certainly not a safe space, and it's certainly not a space that does away with many of the binaries that we've seen and much of the judgment that we've seen in the past of Muslim women. And so this headline, of course, of Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, is borrowed, of course, from Dani's book. And it seems as though no matter what they do, no matter what kind of persona they have, because these are all very different women that I analyzed, we always find ourselves falling back into this binary. Although, of course, the response was different depending on who in the audience is commenting on these particular figures. So I would argue that while we might say digital space is a space that is not embodied, it is one where people can assume whatever identity they want, where they can, they can speak as they wish, they can talk about issues. They are not judged for what they look like. That is not necessarily the case here. So judgment is certainly still present, and we see this weighing in constantly on many of these women. So in the case of Mosque Me Too, which was really in response to instances of sexual harassment that were occurring in spaces like mosques, but then later the conversation broadens beyond that. These women who are coming forward with their stories are still attacked for who they are, even though nobody can see them, nobody knows what they look like. And yet some of the commentary online still has to do with accusing them of being too sexualized, immodest. There are suggestions that if somebody attacked them, they must not have been dressed properly, they must not have presented themselves the right way. There is this denial that there can be any kind of sexism within Muslim communities. Colonialism persists, racism persists, sexism persists. And I have to say, in the same way that I think Yasmin has talked about how difficult it is to read some of these comments, I found the comments directed against Ilhan Omar particularly to be hugely problematic and even sort of traumatizing to read. At one point, she tweets about the death of her father, and there's comments accusing her of bestiality and incest with her father, and making these extraordinarily racist and derogatory comments about her family. And certainly, I think some of us have speculated that perhaps Ilhan Omar is particularly such a flashpoint, that she is such a sort of lightning rod for criticism, because she is not capable of being disembodied online. She is a public figure. Everybody knows who she is. Everybody knows what she looks like. And perhaps, we know the history of anti-Black racism in the United States and elsewhere. Perhaps that is part of the reason why there is such a very strong visceral reaction to Ilhan Omar in particular. And so we see a lot of that harassment continue. And in some ways, I think it continues to be astonishing that any Muslim women enter the public sphere when they're subject to such harassment. So despite the fact that we've seen considerable criticism of Twitter and Facebook and the ways in which they now police speech and cancel culture, that doesn't seem to be evident here. It certainly seems that when there is some cancellation, it's selective. So certainly there is hatred, there is racism, there is sexism, there's discrimination of every kind directed against these women. But at the same time, these women persist. They continue to use their voices. They continue to speak out in ways that I think are progressive and admirable. And I think that they do this because social media, for all of its limitations and for all of the concerns it might raise around harassment and discrimination, continues to provide a platform and a reach beyond what we might find in legacy media. For all of the concerns about Facebook and Twitter policing speech, certainly gatekeeping, I think, is more prominent in legacy media. And certainly you're reaching different audiences. So I think in many ways, for these women that we're talking about here, they are really speaking to a transnational audience. Social media gives them a way to speak out to many different people, and sometimes to give hope to other women who might be silenced and in situations where they can't speak out. So I thought that I would conclude with this quote, a rather famous quote from Moana Alkahawi, where she says, "Patriarchy must fear me." And so I think ultimately what we find in this reaction here, despite the fact that it can be quite discouraging in some ways, is that clearly there is some kind of reach and some kind of significance that we find from these Muslim women. That is why there is such a reaction to them. And in the paper, I talk a little bit more about the contradictory or perhaps problematic nature of some of the feminism they might represent, as in the case of Rahaf Muhammad, for instance. But here, I would just like to conclude by saying that there are so many contradictory expectations of the Muslim women, of the Muslim woman, and digital space does not remove these expectations. They persist, they are problematic, they are limiting. There are still the same limitations that we might find in physical space and the offline world. Digital spaces can be as narrow and as constricting as physical ones. But nonetheless, these women have found ways to blend their digital and offline activism. They know that the counterpublics, to borrow a phrase, that they exist in are contested spaces. They know that they can be dangerous spaces. Some of these women have received death threats, for instance. Sometimes their personal information is posted online. Their family members have been threatened. And yet they persist. And I think they do this because they recognize that this is a space in which their voices continue to carry. And this is the reason why there is such a strong, passionate reaction to them. They continue to be threats as Muslim women. And whether or not you see that as positive or negative, obviously depends on the audience. But I think we can all agree that there is certainly an influence and an impact here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faiza, for demonstrating the ways in which Muslim women are resisting hegemonic discourse of racism, misogyny, and Islamophobia across various digital media. Our last speaker is Dr. Kenza Oumlil, who is an associate professor in communication at Al-Akhawan University in Efran, Morocco. Dr. Oumlil holds a PhD in communication from Concordia University. She has published widely on representation of gender and media. Dr. Oumlil.
Hello, give me just a second, I'm sorry. So I shared with you,
Yes,
but not the PowerPoint, right?
the PowerPoint.
Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, perfect. Sorry, we're using Microsoft Teams over here, so I'm not very familiar with Zoom. First, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the organizers. Of course, I'm mostly grateful to Yasmin. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for everything. And I'll stop here, otherwise it's going to be a very long story. So I'll talk to you a little bit today about the poetry of Suhair Hamad. So I'm very honored to be here as part of this panel. And at the same time, I feel the gravity of this moment, given what is happening with Gaza right now and Gaza being under attack. And so this poetry that I will talk to you today from Suhair Hamad, when I was writing this, I was thinking, well, this was written a number of years ago, but yet I hope that you will see with me how much it is still relevant today. And so I would say, in academia, I would like to talk about the relevance of what we study, but I wish I would say today that I wasn't relevant anymore politically, socially, that these great injustices would not be still happening on the ground. So I'll try today to rationalize a little bit these discourses of faith and hatred, of fear and hatred that have a very, very real impact. As you can see, as it is happening right now in Gaza. I will. Can you see this? The question of representation is what you're seeing. So, so my question was about how are Muslim and Palestinian women represented in the media. This is the original question, but then it turned into how can they talk back? So discourses of resistance, which some of you have already mentioned today. Of course, the starting point, I went to Stuart Hall, but I could have mentioned Simone de Beauvoir or a lot of gender studies scholars, the view of identity as fluid and as socially constructed. But for him, more than that, representation as the language and images created to provide conceptual maps of the world and create culture. And of course, I want to put the emphasis, as I think that everybody agrees here, on the impact that these representations can have very materially. So Yasmin mentioned some of the research about this, and I didn't mention the studies on this slide. I mentioned them in the article, the sort of like key representations of Muslim Palestinian women oppressed, in need of saving, etc. I know Yasmin's latest article is talking about something different, agency that is different from the typical sort of like narrative. They're also representation as exotic beings, and how these representations can be invoked strategically according to the social political mood of the moment. So I take this notion of talking back from bell hooks work. And so basically, to put it very, very briefly, it's this notion of moving from an object to a subject position and acquiring some agency in order to speak for oneself and to actually articulate a counter discourse. And so Hamad's digital interventions here is what I focused on. She's a poet, but what is interesting, as was mentioned earlier, earlier, is that, you know, with poetry, you can also find it online in these videos, etc. So then it has a different life. It has another life, maybe not a different life, but another life. And so how is she challenging Islamophobia? She challenges many different forms of domination. But, you know, the focus here is Islamophobia. I tried to insert a few quotes. And so this is from Zaatar Diva, one of her books. And she says, and I have it in this article, and then I'm looking at it today, your wardrobe ain't louder than this breath. And so the breath here, breathing, life, and how much it is still relevant to with the great loss of Palestinian life and the threat to Palestinian life today. So Suhair Hamad is a Palestinian American poet born in Amman in 73. She was raised in Brooklyn, New York. She received a number of awards. She has been performing her poetry around the world. She challenges stereotypes and presents counter narratives of race and gender. Um, this is a picture from, you know, she's performing here on the brink of for Rachel Corrie, and it's online. It's a video that is online. So she's the author of a memoir, Drops of the Story, and 3 collections of poetry, Born Palestinian, Born Black, Zaatar Diva, and Breaking Poems. And also, besides these collections of poetry, you can find other poems online, which she has written and performed. She has performed her poetry in activist, university, and community-based settings, and they are also archived. Her poems are also archived online, increasing their reach to wider audiences. Again, talking about, this is a video. I think we don't have time, unfortunately. I'm guessing that we don't have a few minutes to share a video of Suhair Hamad. Is this something we can accommodate, or are we running out of time?
No, we are good.
Can we do this? Okay. So how do I do this? Can I just share the link in the chat, or how do I?
You can just place it on YouTube and or click on the link.
So I have to share again, right? Stop sharing and share again.
Yeah.
Okay. So here we go. Share screen. I think this is the one. Ah, it's a photo. Never mind.
Kenza, you have to go onto YouTube to play it and then share your screen.
Is this working now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Uh-oh, we can't hear the sound.
So something is happening with the sound?
Yeah, we can't hear the sound.
Yeah, typically I have the same issue with the Microsoft Teams sometimes. Okay, so never mind. Sorry about that. So maybe I can just post it later on in the chat, and if people are interested, they can watch it. So this is a poem called Gaza, and she says some of the things that she says in this poem are: some must die to send the signal, some must die because they are the vicinity. And so to me, this is really striking with this notion that I've been working on, the notion of talking back. What makes talking back possible? What makes a type of speech that is usually evacuated from the dominant narratives to be heard? And so, and the notion of speaking through death becomes really fascinating. And I can think of the work of Spivak and the notion of subalternity, and, you know, the impossibility, or how is it that the subaltern can speak? Can the subaltern speak? Her seminar article, and she has a follow-up article about that. But also, you know, thinking about all the other instances that we are familiar with, Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia in the context of the Arab Spring, also, you know, speaking through death, right? And in the Moroccan context, Amina Filali, who committed suicide because she was forced to protest a law that exonerates a rapist from his crime if he marries his victim. So this is also, speaking through death. And so Suhair Hamad is pointing to this. Some must die to send the signal. Does it take, does it have to go to that extent for somebody to communicate a message or to achieve an impact? I'll go very quickly through some of the literature. Islamophobia, how is it linked to racialization of Muslims? Okay, here I just have a very
Kenza,
direct quote. Yes,
can you
can
stop
you hear me?
sharing the screen? Yeah, can you stop sharing the screen?
Yes. Okay, sorry. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Here, I'm back to the PowerPoint now, yes? Okay, so Islamophobia refers to a fear or hatred of Islam and Muslims, and how this is linked to the racialization of Muslims. And so Muslim identity as being racially ambiguous. And so Faizal a little bit was talking about the diversity of uh, the women that she was looking at through these tweets. And so it's racially ambiguous, but viewed in a monolithic way. However, racial ambiguity is not shared by all, as Faiza just highlighted through the example of Ilhan Omar. So Islamophobia constructs Islam as a backward religion, Muslims as inferior, and Stephen Salaita also says that they're not irrational. This is not irrational, but it's really a set of prejudices against Muslims. So of course, as was mentioned in the video game analysis, we go back to the work of Edward Said, to the his theory of Orientalism, the notion of race thinking, and we're talking about Muslims, but Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians occupies such a center stage. I mean, we've talked about how the political context of the different wars, the Iraq war, etc., the war in Afghanistan, and the 9/11 context, but also this question of Palestine, which has been going on since 1948, is very much at the core of this context. Digital media, as we've mentioned before in other presentations, has a role of self-promotion. So it offers opportunities to empower people who find themselves at the margins of society to express themselves. It can be even an avenue for alternative media, which of course is not to be conflated with digital media. So it has some positive attributes for Arab artists, for Muslim artists, etc. So I conducted a textual analysis and a semi-structured interview. I looked at the notions of talking back and how, and the question of the circulation of her art in the digital public sphere. And so these are just some perhaps interesting aspects of my analysis. So I focused on First Writing Since, which is really the poem that propelled Suhair Hamad into the public sphere, because she circulated it immediately after after September 11, the terrorist attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. And it was a turning point for her, because they were looking for the Muslim voice, and Russell Simmons came across it and signed her onto a deal with HBO Poetry, Deaf Poetry Jam. And so this became a really a defining moment in her trajectory as an artist. So this was the paradox of September 11, is that it also opened up doors for Muslim artists to express themselves in the media. And so and the other moment was in this moment, first in this poem, First Writing Since, one of the things that she mentions, which presented an alternative discourse, is both my brothers, gentle Muslim men. So here she is challenging the entire stereotype of the violent Muslim men. In her TED talk, which is another digital moment for her, she communicates an anti-war message. There's a commitment to peace when she says, for instance, "I will not dance to your war drum." And so what she has been doing, what Hamad has been doing, is building bridges across multiple communities and positions of marginality transnationally. And so what is really important is that she counters this racism and Islamophobia from a feminist perspective, and that gender equality takes a center stage for her. And she even says that she, writes for women, and then and you really feel that in her poetry. She also reveals how racialization is socially constructed and the racial ambiguity of Islamophobia. She underscores the material consequences of discourses of fear and hatred. And okay, and so this circulates in the public, in the digital public sphere, and so very positively, it increases her ability to circulate her art to a wider audience, and perhaps most interestingly, to subaltern counter publics, as Nancy Fraser would put it, which are arenas where counter discourses would circulate, and so the question of the audience becomes really important, or the targeted audience. Okay, what would be the targeted audience if the idea is to effect positive social political change? So who is the targeted audience here? And perhaps it's very interesting to see that there is an impact for these subaltern counter publics. Obviously, as we've mentioned, there's the rise of surveillance, the loss of privacy, but also the backlash, the hate speech, the online harassment, the cyberbullying that can take place. But what makes her stories relatable is not just, to not fall into technological determinism. It's not the fact that, these things are available online. It's also the specificities of her stories that make her work so compelling. As she told me herself very clearly when I interviewed her, that this was what she aimed to do, is to write about the specificities rather than writing in generalities. So technology and the form of hip hop enable access. So the form of hip hop as well, being a popular mode of communication, enables access. The hate, the hate that, or the hatred and the backlash that she encounters online, for example, she said in an interview in 2018, that she's the face that they can hate, but my face isn't really that, to be the face that they can hate, but my face isn't really that hateable. So like other quote unquote minority artists who are circulating their arts in the digital public sphere, this requires a type of performativity of identity. To what extent are they speaking on behalf of a community? And at the same time that they're trying to unsettle essentialism, that is the goal, to challenge the stereotypes, etc. But at the same time, they are invited to speak as a Palestinian or as a Muslim or as an Arab woman, etc. So how is this being, how this duality is being lived by them? So she says that the need to perform for her, the need to deliver her poems comes from a vacuum in dominant narratives, and she lists the different types of vacuums in different dominant narratives, whether it's the Palestinian dominant narrative or dominant narrative about Muslim women, dominant narrative about Arab women, etc. So she advocates intersectionality. I don't know if she uses this word herself, but she said, in my interview with her, I come from all these different communities who complement each other. So she's very much aware of this notion of intersectionality, and she doesn't view identity as being simple. I'm going to end. This is the how I ended the article. So I would like to end it here. This is from the poem On the Brink of, and it's about Rachel Corrie, who was a white American activist who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer. She was trying to protect a Palestinian pharmacist's home from being demolished, and she was wearing bright orange. So in this poem, Suhair Hamad says, how is it that she couldn't be seen because she was wearing bright orange? And so she says, I quote, on the brink of war, may our power come from the people Rachel Corrie was murdered defending. On the brink of war, may our hope come from one another. On the brink of, wait, this is not a war. On the brink of whatever newfangled imperialist project this is, may Rachel Corrie live in our resistance, in our pursuit of justice, and in the spirit of sisterhood. On the brink of war, may we remember how divine human beings can be. End quote. So what Suhair Hamad has been trying to do for all these years through her writings and her performances, embodied performances and also performances online, is to counter Islamophobia and other forms of domination. And I would like to argue to talk about talking back as an end goal. Because we're here talking from the field of communication studies and not as political scientists. So what's the point of this activity? So talking back as an end goal, and for me, one of the most inspiring readings that I did about this was Trent Minha, who talks about the telling of a story, even if it condemns her present life, to tell that story, right? So the idea of speaking, right? Not necessarily persuasive speaking. And again, whom do we try to persuade? For me, is very important. So when we talk about all this hate speech online, do we talk to those people? Are we engaging? Is this where our energy is supposed to be placed? Is it a fruitful exercise? Is it a safe exercise even? Because, you know, as you have mentioned, I think Faiza and Yasmin writes about this, and some of the women that I've interviewed also told me about the death threats, right? So this is the sort of like extreme continuum of racism and Islamophobia, is the loss of life. And it's not the loss of life, is putting it mildly, is to be killed, right? The hate crimes, feminicides, etc. So talking back as an end goal, because it's already a challenge. It's already a struggle to just talk, to express a perspective. And so I find myself very luckily, I'm here, understand in a way very luckily, and perhaps not so luckily, because I'm what's happening in Gaza, I'm just looking at my Facebook and reading articles and whatever, and I get a very different perspective. And so and then somehow I hear about this Biden and and Harris, and then it's an entirely, Israel has the right to defend itself, and it's an entirely different discourse. So it's a different sort of like bubble. And so and the sort of like logic of that just strikes me all the time, which is, it's not logical. It's, you know, to really think about that, how does that become the dominant logic, right? When it seems to me such a simple story that becomes so complicated when it really isn't, right? And how difficult it is to even talk about that in a Western context, to express a different type of perspective. And so Suhair Hamad is trying to leave a material trace about one of the hardest stories that we live in today, the Palestinian question, one of the hardest stories of dehumanization, of injustice. And she calls for a redistribution of symbolic power. And I hope I didn't take too long. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenza, for showing us how poetry and spoken word and other creative writing and performance works can sort of create an alternative space for expression of love, kinship, and compassion. Thank you. I think we have some time for our attendees to ask questions. If anyone has question, you can post it in the chat or simply unmute yourself.
People could raise their hands too, so we could unmute them. Maybe I have a question about how to deploy the articles that you have all worked on, how to deploy it in the classroom, and what type of pedagogy is needed. Because again, it's a new academic typography, and how to actually, what type of approaches to have it in the classroom, both in at least women and gender studies, but also outside, how to approach that.
Well, I wouldn't mind commenting on that quickly if that's okay, but not with regard to my article. I was actually thinking, as Tanner and Taha were presenting, that it made me think of a whole discussion we've been having in one of my undergraduate classes, where we look at media and audiences, and so the different ways that different audiences can interact or deploy different kinds of media. And so one of the things we talked about was actually video games towards the end of the semester. And it's quite interesting, you know, there's certain topics where there's some kind of cohesion in the class in terms of what they think, but video games, there wasn't. And so there was a very polarized kind of perspective, because I brought in, you know, like the ideas of moral panic, for instance, and this idea that, yeah, what I think is a long-standing idea that video games can be corrupting. And during the pandemic, we've really seen a lot of attention to this notion of, you know, what does it mean to have people on video games all the time? And I think particularly around young men, I feel as though that's the case, although I have to say it's not my area. But so one of the things I had brought up in my class, but it was older research, was around the Gulf War and the ways that I think Kareem talks about this in The Islamic Peril, the use of video games as a way of training military and desensitizing and dehumanizing the enemy. And so it's, I think it's upsetting, but also useful for students to see that this is something where I think you're identifying a very clear through line. Where this does indeed happen, it persists. It is a very real way of recruiting young people into military action and getting them on board too. And I think too, I've seen articles recently suggesting that video games are I don't know if it's a popular way, but increasingly a way that white supremacists recruit online. And so I think to see, for instance, like the simulation of the Christchurch shooting, though it's, I personally find it very upsetting, but I feel as though this might be a useful pedagogical tool, because I think for many students in my classrooms, it's sad, but it feels impersonal. And I wonder if in some ways this would make it more relatable and give them this sense that this is not just something we talk about in academic terms, this is widespread. And so anyway, I certainly would be really interested in showing you that presentation to many of my students. And I'm sure I could talk about the others in that way, but I'll give other people airtime.
Right, if I could comment on that, Faiza. So I agree with that. It's, as you said, it could be divisive in some sort of way. People don't always agree on these topics. And to answer your question, Professor Hatem, regarding how we can introduce these topics, I think one way, as Faiza kind of touched upon, is, opening it up for debate among students, right? I think anytime when we're given the chance to encourage academic discourse regarding these types of topics, it's always a good opportunity for people to share their opinions and perspectives on these types of things. If I were to speak on Tanner's in my article, for instance, with video games, presenting our research to students and allowing them to provide kind of their own perspectives or discuss amongst each other their own opinions on games that they've played perhaps, and maybe to allow them to kind of think or brainstorm amongst each other different representations of different people in other types of video games. Essentially, any time you can open up for a classroom to allow them to have their own chance to debate amongst one another or just provide their own perspectives in a kind of focus group manner, I think it's a good engaging way to allow people to provide their own perspectives on any types of research that we have. It could be applied to video games or to really any of the topics here. I think the best way to encourage people to learn, I think, is to open up the classroom for debate and for the sharing of perspectives.
I'd add to that, because I think, there's a couple of things that sort of strike me right there. One is the notion that anytime you do anything like that, you have to have a trigger warning. So trigger warnings have become a way in which we can't talk about the violence that's done. But one way around that I think that I've used is analogies. So for instance, the idea that you have a law that says that you're prohibited from doing something, but yet certain people can get away with doing it. It is like which bodies can then be used to get away with it and which bodies can't, right? So bringing it back to the whole notion of what is considered like with the video game thing, what is considered to be a worthy body or a body worth saving, versus which bodies can be killed over and over and over again. So which ones are completely disposable, right? And that will, through the sort of like the regeneration of the avatars, keep coming back for you to be able to shoot them over and over again. So it's like placing the person in that as the victim and saying, how do you then feel if somebody were to do that to you over and over and over again? So that kind of sort of analogy, and also the Barthian notion of substitution, I think really helps in terms of the way that when I teach, that's how I try to do it without reducing it to essentialism.
Right.
But it is really interesting, like how do we get around, particularly because we do have, and Kenza, in a way, I'm so glad that you brought up the whole Palestinian perspective, because we have an issue right now in Canada where the Canadian government has signed a declaration, which is the IHRA, which can be interpreted to mean that if you were to criticize the state of Israel, then you would be considered anti-Semitic and also be charged with doing this. So we can criticize any country in the world, including the US, but not the state of Israel. And
You
this
could
has become a
criticize
bone of
Canada,
contention.
but
Yes.
you cannot criticize a foreign country.
It can't, yeah. No, we can criticize Canada, Uganda, Kenya, India, any country except for the state of Israel.
Yeah.
So this has become, in fact, this is one of the reasons why this whole thing kind of moved from University of Toronto out to Hatem's base, because it was a way in which, how do you deal with this? And this is something that a lot of the unions actually are grappling with now, because it does impinge on freedom of speech, but that's the same argument that's used for somebody like Jordan Peterson as well, right? That it's the freedom of speech. So, how does that freedom actually get weighed? And where are people on the hierarchy in terms of having freedom, the freedom to speak?
Yeah.
And that's the limit of free speech over there. We have different limits over here, different red lines,
Yeah.
things that we can't talk about that we're very familiar with. But even before this law, this was the feeling that I had overall in North America. That was the sensitive issue. That was the the tricky issue. That was that you could talk about so many things, but when it came to that, when it came to Palestine, no. Yeah.
I think there's a question by Sarah. Can you comment on transnational feminisms and psychology and the intersection with Islamophobia? It's in the question box.
This is a question for me?
No, it's the audience member is Sarah.
Oh, I was like, okay, yeah, take it away, because I don't think it's to me.
Sarah, go ahead.
Transnational feminism and psychology. That's definitely not my area, so I can't.
I'm not sure what they mean.
I wonder if it's, I think was it Fanon? I can't remember who did borrow from Lacan and talk about the fact that for some people, like the notion of women veiling, for instance, could be seen as a threat to masculinity. But I'm certainly no expert on psychoanalytic feminism, but I'm wondering if that's where the question is going.
Yeah, I think there's.
Can you say the question again? Can you,
If
because
you
we
click,
can't see it.
It's in the Q&A, Yasmin.
you click
Can
on
you
the
see it?
Q&A, you will see it.
Okay,
Yeah. There is actually
okay, I see.
a volume that came out on Islamophobia and psychiatry, as well as Robert Bishar, who's in New Mexico, has a couple of volumes that he also worked on that. So we have a specialized area that developed, and they presented in 2 of the conferences in Islamophobia. So maybe I could point you to that work for Sarah.
Hmm. I mean, the second part of the question in terms of the intersection with Islamophobia and transnational feminism, I think that is certainly something that this volume, this particular issue has tried to do in terms of fleshing out the ways in which the connections that are afforded by the digital technologies transcend the nation state, the boundaries of the nation state. And so make it very feasible and possible for us to engage in discussions and dialogue around issues that are quite far apart geographically, spatially, but that come together in so many different ways. So when I think about the women who are returning from ISIS-controlled lands and who have been with ISIS fighters, then this is clearly a transnational phenomena. And it's transnational both in terms of where the women have come in from, because there are a substantial number of women that did join ISIL from a variety of different countries, but also what happens to the person who then gets reduced to a femina sacra, the gendered counterpart of homo sacer. So how then with Shamima Begum, how does citizenship become so conditional that it can be stripped and she can be sent off to a place that she doesn't even know, wasn't even raised in, and yet because she comes from that ancestry as a Bengali can now be sent back? So what does that mean in terms of these women that are coming back? Say, for instance, the woman from who was originally from Somalia, even though she might have been born here, the fact that she can now be stripped of that citizenship and be deported to a place where she doesn't. And we've seen countless examples of this. Young Jamaican men that were born and raised in Canada being sort of like deported to Jamaica without any sense of having been brought up there, but just because their ancestry links them there. So the transnational element seems to work all the way around.
I think also too, you're right. I think it does work all the way around. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, as I say, I'm not sort of an expert on psychoanalytic feminism, but I think that it does seem like no matter where we look, this sense of threat from Muslim women seems like a very pervasive kind of idea. And it's not always clear why. I mean, some of the causes that get taken up don't really seem to pose a real threat, right? Like what I have to call the persecution of women who wear niqab, for instance, or even, Bill 21. There is no real, as far as I can see, logic to it, but perhaps, and there's been a lot of work lately on, why anti-Black racism persists in the United States, and some of that rooted in psychology, like this sort of notion that it is not possible for one group to advance if another group advances, when in fact, a lot of political and economic theory tells us that's not true. There's room for everyone to advance. But so I'm still not sure myself. I mean, I think that I'm always sort of grappling with this idea of why do people care so much about what Muslims are doing? Sometimes we're talking about a very tiny percentage of the population, and what they're doing doesn't affect everyone else. And so it does seem like there must be some kind of psychological root to this. The only thing I've ever been able to think of is that it's this sort of fear of losing status, perhaps, like this idea that if you let the foreigners take over, because it does seem to be always sort of framed in this foreign term, that it will somehow remove the status of what is seen as the dominant group. But I think I'm still kind of working through this myself, and I think that's why we're all sort of struggling a little bit to come up with an answer. But I think it's a really important question, because I think that ultimately a lot of these questions are about sort of a personal psychological mindset, or maybe a communitarian psychological mindset, and this sense that Muslims pose some essential threat to way of life, well-being, status, in ways that, practically speaking, are not borne out by the data, which is not really an answer to your question, except to say I think it's a good question.
Mhm.
If I could
I
just
want
jump
to
in.
add, yeah, sorry, Tana. Just to add a dimension to that. One of the in bringing the transnational focus back, when we think about the world and we think about sort of like what's happening to the Uyghurs, what's happening to the Rohingya, what's happening to, so it's like everywhere. And these women that left Canada and left many of the European countries basically said the same thing. They said, look, if you look around the world, what's happening to the Muslim Ummah? Where can we actually live a life that allows us to live it in terms of our own authenticity, our own sort of like, um, the ability to be able to be in a community, as you were saying, like a community, have this feeling of communitas, being around people that are like us and that pray like us and that believe in these things. So that element, I mean, in part, it's sort of like the fact that there is such a rapid connection going on. Like Kenza, you were talking about what's happening in Palestine right now. Like we know about like what's happening in China, what's happening in in different parts of the world, what's happening, like Zainab, your work with the Hindutva, what's happening in India, for instance. So everywhere the Muslims come across as being targeted, and in fact, Besma Momani's book, Targeted Transnational, really brings this up because it's the idea that it is such a victimized group that where then can you find some kind of refuge in a way?
Thank you. And just related to Faiza's points, I mean, I think that there's a really, really great, Black Marxist tradition coming out of the United States that explains sort of, W. Du Bois, for example, The Wages of Whiteness, and talks about the sort of strategic uses of race and racism to sort of divide sort of white working class people, both from sort of white bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the owning class, and then deflect those class antagonisms onto racialized others that are sort of stand-ins for a whole bunch of social problems they do not in themselves cause. So I think the Marxist traditions always tried to explain it in that sort of class division term, from the 19th century forward. And there's so much work today on the wages of whiteness. And even, I mean, when you look at the far right and the white nationalist right and the alt-right, it's really about resurrecting 19th century bourgeois ethno-nationalism, creating an essential notion of like an Anglo-American identity as distinct, as with no interaction from other identities, and then basically saying this is under threat. And in the US, I think in the whole history of empire, it's like at different moments in time, always targeted specific groups that then relate to an externalized other that the US is basically occupying or at war with. And I think we see, even over the last 3 years, China being especially kind of framed in this particular way as related to the anti-Asian hate crimes currently now as well. So it's like class, capital, and empire is, I think, the larger matrix that I would try to understand the psychology of racist white folks,
If I may just, I think the clash of civilization thesis of Huntington is one of the most pernicious ideological driving force. And Huntington said, there can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. And this is again the framing after the Cold War, because the US and the global North had constructed and sharpened its teeth on anti-communist and anti-Soviet Union. And as the Soviet Union collapses, now they're searching for their own identity by trying to identify the object of their hate, which I argue that they're putting Christian theology on its head, because if the basis of Christian theology is love thy enemy, what Huntington is saying is defending Judeo-Christian tradition by actually negating Jesus. So in essence, what you have is a putting theology on its head, love thy enemy, turn the other cheek. And what you have is really an attempt to extend the military-industrial complex, the militarism, and reshaping the same type of dynamics in the political discourse of the global North in the post-Cold War era. And it's interesting that all of these white nationalists, white supremacists, even what I call center right, and maybe also center left, they all have adopted the clash of civilization narrative. So you'll have, George Peterson, and you have Bill Maher. that both argue. You'll have Macron, who's supposedly is counted to be also from the left, but it's actually the left of fascism. That's basically what we have, is coming with the same type of framing, replacement theory, clash of civilization, that they're about to take us, that gives the rationale for this massive militarism, massive power, massive reorganization of the society. So I say that the Muslims are the patsy that are being used to actually reintroduce this discredited identity. So I said that if your car breaks down, most likely it's a Muslim in the engine that cheated the engine, rather than VW cheated everything within the engine. Right? So it helps project problems somewhere else. And I think China is there as being introduced, the Sino-Islamic alliance that is being spoken of.
And it was really in the 90s, just to follow up on that point, that, you know, Hollywood sort of needed a new big other for American empire and did shift away from the communists and the red and the socialists to a whole bunch of different terrorist threats that were being configured as related to different ethno-cultural identities. And it was very, very fluid throughout the 90s. After the global war on terror is launched, it all kind of gets articulated, mostly sort of to the Muslim as the threat.
And you could see the shift from Rambo being a savior of Afghanistan and fighting with the Mujahideen, to the Soviet Union collapses, and now the Muslims have a new role. So you have what you call, we introduce Arabic, Urdu, Farsi for Hollywood purposes. All what you need is a couple of grunts and you get terrorist number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 as a supporting actor for your dehumanization and erasure.
But that, you know, I just want to bring it back because I think, I mean, we have another question in the chat, but before we get to that, I want to bring it back to the notion that that's a very American perspective, though. When we think about Europe and its relationship to Islam, the idea of Christendom versus Islam has always sort of like been at the forefront. And I mean, when you think about the Crusades and even before that, the Saracens, I mean, all of this sort of like, so I think that relationship, and Prina Wertner actually has a very good very short article on this, where she talks about how Islam has been constructed in Europe and how this sort of like, it is the great sort of like the complete opposite in a way. That's how it's been constructed. And so maybe one could talk about this in terms of the import of that European legacy into the US, particularly in terms of the treatment of the Black Muslims, right, which has been talked about in the literature. But then how it gets converted into these sort of geopolitical wars or wars of position within different states. But I think in Europe, it's got that bulwark, that sort of like sedimented history of this animosity to Islam is so deep that it's the only way one can even explain or at least shed light on the kinds of dynamics of colonization that are like French colonialism, Italian colonialism, you know, all of these in terms of parts of Africa. I'm thinking about North Africa and the MENA region, for instance, right? So I think that we need to be careful about this, because it can't all be subsumed and in terms of this recent American animosity. It's like it has its roots way back. And the European legacy, I think, is really sort of like a place to start.
No, I agree with you on terms of the longer durée, in terms of even the term Islamophobia comes out to us from the French context around 1910 and so on. But I think David Miller's and his group, in terms of mapping the Islamophobia industry, that it seems that the US piping its own geopolitical influence is now shaping, especially with the massive amount of resources that are being deployed. And I would also add the funding that is coming from Arab and Muslim majority countries that want also to demonize Islam, Muslim in the public sphere in Europe, in order to consolidate support from Europe for their own authoritarian, despotic, dictatorial policies. The recent funding of United Arab Emirates of actually the National Front, Marie Le Pen's party was about to go bankrupt, and they infused money and resources for Marie Le Pen. So you have these dynamics in there, and then the alliance right now between the Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, and some of the neocons. We have a research coming out on India, Israel, Middle East foreign pipes, and how that gets to be rolled in as we see the attacks on Gaza and Palestine, that the Hindutva supporters are coming out in front of to be supportive of Israel, that we're with Israel in protest in the United States. So there's really all types of lines that are being intertwined, with history being navigated and mined in order to construct these, what you call trans-historical tropes to demonize the Muslim subject.
I think our time is up, right?
Yes. Well, we could, again, we're academic, we could continue talking.
There was a hand up. Sorry, there was a hand up for a while, I think, from Yusuf.
Yeah, this.
But indeed, let's see if I could get, okay, let's
With
allow.
Iqbal Ahmed.
Yeah,
Iqbal Ahmed has a question.
Okay, and so I got Yusufi you are able to speak. So if you go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, just a second. So I have a pretty short question for Yasmin. Yasmin, you noted that typically Muslim women are seen to lack agency. That isn't the case for women who married ISIS fighters, which are not perceived, these women aren't perceived as rather as traitors to the Canadian nation. Nonetheless, it doesn't seem to me that these women characterized as brides are portrayed as embodying the same level of threat as terrorist Muslim men. So can you elaborate a little bit upon the ways in which the bride fits alongside the figure of the terrorist Muslim men?
In the article, one of the things that I pointed out is that there has to be an inverse kind of a relationship between masculinity and femininity that are played out on this stage. And so when you have a brutal, barbaric Muslim man, you have to have the abject Muslim woman who can be saved. When you have a Muslim woman that is challenging authority, then she becomes something else. She becomes an even greater threat. One way in which she becomes a threat is in terms of importing that ideology through socialization, but also in terms of reproducing the nation. So when we think about like how feminism, like imperial feminism has worked, one way has been for women, like an organization called the Daughters of the Empire, to then say that we don't want to give the vote to so-and-so because we are the reproducers of the nation. For ISIS, a lot of these women were recruited to reproduce ISIL. That's what their job was. But this is something that they went on willingly. So it was the idea that they had the agency, that they exercised their agency to run away from home, to like the Besnell girls did. And what's happening here is now the idea of them coming in and being able to one, have lots of children that could potentially be terrorists. That's one thing. Second, being walking bombs, time bombs. That's how they're sort of referred to. So like the Chechnyan women who were, for instance, the suicide bombers, here you have this kind of this slow time bomb, and the idea that these women were themselves sort of not only agentic in terms of leaving, but also agentic in terms of bringing it back, an ideology that is contrary and an anathema to the West. So you can see the shifting ways in which the women, it's no longer the imperial Muslim woman. It's actually a very malicious, manipulative, powerful, hyper breeder that can sort of like make her way in and be completely opportunistic and take advantage. And so she becomes sort of like the front line of the male. And it was interesting to see how even in this installment, you had the first installment was actually of Ali, who wanted to come back home, who is now sort of seen as broken down, weak, and so forth, and now wants to come back despite having committed all these horrific crimes. But now you see the women coming in, and they are masquerading This is how they're talked about, as masquerading under this sort of pretense of innocence and then trying to get in. So there's a complementarity that's working there. I hope I've answered your question. Yusuf? I think he's gone.
Yeah.
We should attend to Iqbal Ahmed's question. Is there a plan to contact different academic universities in the US and Canada to discuss and to request to put or add discourse in the class or courses about the topics discussed today?
Well, I think just to give you a sense of the open access for the journal through JSTOR, we're having a really robust download, almost 15,000 downloads per month of journal articles. Some of the top articles will go about 1,800 to 2,000 downloads per article. But I do recommend for people to actually include these articles in your syllabi, recommend it to some of your colleagues as we share resources academically. Also, if you develop sometimes a PowerPoint for your particular article, it will be also good to load it up in some of your sites for people to share in that way. Also, we will also send out some announcement for people who are interested to contact the authors for conversations, for possible invites, because again, the written piece can have a long life, and what we need is to continue to engage and plow the field. What you have is really a transnational network right now on the field of Islamophobia, and we're very well connected to Australia, New Zealand, India, China, various universities in Europe. So we have about a network of 200 plus individuals, scholars that work on various areas of Islamophobia. And I think what we need is to pull each other work forward as we plow this new field of scholarship. So we co-producers, co-participants in forging the field of Islamophobia studies.
And I think even more so to sort of extend this into the STEM fields. I think that in humanities and social science, there's certainly a space, and much more work needs to be done to integrate this into the curriculum at all levels. But it's the STEM fields which really are sort of still drawing so much money and so much sort of influence from both industry and government that, I mean, even in my institution, like the level of conversation in my faculty versus like the other faculties, like in business, and like, they're just not with it, you know? And so how do we sort of not only expand it academically, but across all the disciplines and faculties? That's, I think, another challenge for universities.
I think we can finish it off. What do you think?
Yes.
Thank you again, Dr. Bazian, Yasmin, our speakers, our attendees, who actually put a lot of time today and listen to our conversation. Thank you again for doing this, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Zeinab.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hatem, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Professor Hatem and Yasmin.